Guten Tag, WAP. This is Mr. Liniger. Let's make history today as we go over Unit 4, Day 5. Today we're going to go over the Mexican Revolution of 1910. But let's get started with our daily punishment. I bought a boat because it was for sale. For sale. Key terms for today: Zaibatsus, the Tanaka Memorial, Porfirio Diaz, Emiliano Zapata, Francisco Madero, Pancho Villa, Victoriana Huerta, Obregón, Cardenas, El PRI, the Mexican Constitución de 1917. We're going to go over the causes and effects of the Mexican Revolution and the reasons and the effects for Japanese imperialism in the 20th century. So let's get started. Japan felt cheated at the Treaty of Versailles. They wanted Germany's Asian colonies, and they did get most of that land, but they thought they were going to get more Pacific colonies from other countries. In the 1920s, Japan's going to turn increasingly hostile and imperialistic. They're going to favor an authoritarian state, even though Japan was a democracy. Really, it was the generals that were in charge. Very few people in Japan could vote. It was only like 5% of the population. There were property requirements. Even in the 1920s, Japan is going to plan for a war, and they're going to conquest in the interwar period. The economic industrialization, the Meiji Revolution, is going to lead to many changes in Japan. There's going to be huge industrial combines that produce multiple resources called zaibatsus, which will launch the expansion of heavy industry. By 1925, the state will initiate compulsory primary school education. However, Japan, though industrialized, will rely heavily on raw resources from other countries because they don't have a lot of raw resources in their countries. In the 1920s, Japan's military leaders are going to take a greater role. In 1928, Japan's going to create the Tanaka Memorial for their war generals, which will draw up a plan for the Pacific War. So even in 1928, they were coming up with ideas of what would happen if they got into a war in the Pacific. During this time, there'll be a plethora of revolutions along the world. A lot of these revolutions will challenge Western dominance, and they'll offer alternatives to the Western model. Iran will have a revolution in 1905, the Young Turks in 1908, Mexico in 1910, China in 1911, 1912, which we talked about. Russia is going to have two, which we talked about briefly, but we're going to talk about next class. There'll be a revolution in Egypt in 1919, which we mentioned. Turkey in the 1920s, we mentioned that. India is going to start having civil disobedience in the 1920s. And China is going to have their communist and nationalist civil war in the 1920s through 40s. Let's talk about Mexico's revolution specifically. The big cause of the Mexican Revolution was their president/dictator, Porfirio Diaz. In 1910, Diaz had already ruled for like 20, 30 years. He was a dictator. He rigged elections. He had control of the media. He had his friend in places. There's going to be an election in 1910, which again, he will steal. The person that was opposing him was Francisco Madero. He's going to rig this election again, and the people are going to rise up. They were unhappy with Diaz's policies. He favored foreign businesses. He was corrupt. A lot of Mexicans did not feel like they were gaining anything from his industrialization because it really favored only the rich. The revolution in Mexico is going to be unique in that it was very regional. Different parts of Mexico will rebel for different reasons. Pancho Villa will organize a rebellion in northern Mexico against Diaz. In Morales, Zapata is going to rally the Indians and peasants behind the banner of land reform. Zapata will really focus on land reform and helping out the poor. The rebels will drive Diaz from power and replace him with Madero. Madero's moderate program of reform proved inadequate. He was a reformer, but his programs were going too slowly. So in 1913, a military coup is going to remove Madero. They'll have him assassinated. The military didn't even like him to begin with. The new general in charge will be General Victoriano Huerta, who will become dictator. Immediately, Pancho Villa and Zapata will rebel again. Huerta will fall from power in 1914. The continuing revolutionaries will continue to fight amongst themselves over what type of new government they will have. In 1920, the revolution will end. Obregón will become the president of Mexico and will try to resuscitate the Mexican economy. Under Cardenas, who is president from 1934 to 1940, he will give land reform to the Mexicans. He'll nationalize foreign industry and give it back to Mexican businesses. And he really will start to stabilize Mexico. After the revolution, Mexico will create the Constitution that they still follow today, the Constitución de 1917. This is like the basis of modern Mexican government, although it's not always followed. The Mexican Constitution of 1917 promises land reform and educational reform. It limits foreign ownership of Mexican industry. It guarantees the right of the workers, and it's going to limit the Catholic Church's ownership of the land and really the power of the Catholic Church. Let's talk a little bit about some changes in Mexico during this time. There is going to be a rediscovery of Indian heritage in Mexico after the revolution, in art and in just like cultural interest. The Catholic Church, for the most part, did not like the Mexican Revolution because it was more secular. The church is going to oppose the secularism of Mexican society. They're going to form their own movement called the Cristo movement. The church is not happy when the Mexican government tries to make schools secular. And the Cristero movement is going to actually rebel against the Mexican government. It will be pushed down, but it's going to be pretty bloody. The Catholic Church is going to take the side of reaction and conservatism during this time. America almost gets in a war with Mexico during this time. America will bombard Veracruz because Mexico refused to salute the American flag. Pancho Villa is actually going to attack a town in the United States. And Pancho Villa was upset. He was under the impression that America promised that they would support him as their leader. When they do not support him, Pancho Villa makes it his life goal to kill as many gringos as possible. And he actually invades a town in America, Columbus, New Mexico. America is actually going to send an army into Mexico to try to capture Pancho Villa. They pull out the army before they can get him because World War I is starting and America gets involved. When Cardenas becomes president, he's going to nationalize American oil industries. During that time, America is going to be led by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is more favorable towards Mexico. And even though it hurt American businesses, FDR will allow that to happen. The major Mexican political party is going to develop during this time. It's called the Party of Institution Revolution, or the Partido Revolución Instituto, El PRI. El PRI was technically a liberal party on the left. It was a democratic party. But really, it's going to be pretty corrupt during this time. It's going to do the same kind of things you see in a lot of countries, rigging elections, giving jobs to its friends and supporters. And it's going to dominate political parties and offices in Mexico from the 1920s all the way to the 1990s. In Mexico, even though they were a democracy, they really are a one-party state. It's not like, they're not like communism where like if you try to become a different party, you get killed. They just rig all the elections. One of the reasons El PRI stays in power for so long, however, was the economy is going to boom under El PRI. Mexico is going to industrialize and going to have an oil boom. So for the most part, for most of this time, the Mexican standard of living will improve. All right, guys, that's all I have for you for today. Until next time, deuces, deuces, deuces.